The sun burned low over the cracked red earth of Mbali, casting long shadows over the once thriving farmlands. Dust rose with every step the herders took, trailing behind the emaciated cattle that refused to eat from barren soil. The baobab trees stood like tired elders, their branches dry and brittle, bearing witness to yet another year of failed rain. Once the Okamba clan had been proud, keepers of song, warriors of the grasslands, feared and respected among the 5 southern clans. Now they were whispers of their former selves, weakened by hunger, haunted by the ghosts of dead harvests and fallen sons. At the center of the village, the elders sat in a tight circle, robes faded, voices low. Smoke rose from the fire pit where the last of the sacred herbs burned, their scent barely masking the bitterness in the air. The oldest among them, Chief Nkuluduma, bore the weight of decisions too heavy for any single man. His eyes, once fierce, now flickered with doubt as he turned to the wrapped bundle resting on a woven mat beside him. It was long and narrow, wrapped in red and gold cloth. Mtunzi, the blade of legend, offered in exchange for something far more precious than gold. The offer had come on the wings of despair. News had traveled swiftly. Bika of the Red Sands, the warrior who fought alone beneath the eclipsed moon, had arrived at the village outskirts. He came not with an army but with a single proposition: one life for a weapon. The whisper said he was born in the dunes, raised by spirits and marked by war. No one knew his face beneath the ochre paint, only the stories he left behind in the blood-soaked sand. Aanda stood in the shadows of her family's compound, her back pressed to the mud wall, fingers trembling against her faded shawl. She had heard the low, urgent tones through the cracked door, the decision being spoken into existence without her presence, without her name uttered like it mattered. She was the youngest daughter of Duma, barely 17 reins to her name, clever of tongue and quick of foot, always reading, always questioning. She had long dreamt of leaving the village, of becoming a griot like her grandmother, traveling across Mbali and singing the truth into the wind. But now she was a price. Her mother, Mazola, approached her silently, her hands worn and calloused. She said nothing at first, only brushed the dirt from Ayanda's cheek and smoothed down her tightly coiled hair. Then, with a voice brittle as dry reeds, she whispered, "You are the water that must quench the fire, my child. For the clan." Aanda turned her face away. "They trade me for a blade. Not even for cattle or coin. A blade." Mazola did not meet her eyes. "A blade that might save your brothers. But what saves me?" Ayanda's voice cracked, her anger tangled in sorrow. From the circle of elders the drumming began, soft at first, then building, announcing the union to come. Ayanda's fate had been sealed before she could argue, before she could run. Her dreams scattered like seeds in the wind, carried far beyond reach. Somewhere beyond the huts, the sun dipped lower, and a red-cloaked figure stood still against the horizon, waiting. Bika's arrival was neither grand nor loud. There were no war cries, no drumming of victory, no horses thundering across the plains. Just dust. A dry wind rose from the south as he walked into the village alone, wrapped in layers of deep red ochre robes that clung to his massive frame like dried blood. His face was mostly hidden beneath the shadow of a carved wooden mask and a hood that dropped low over his brow. His presence was enough to still conversations mid-sentence, enough to make the children stop playing and disappear behind doorways, their curious eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder. He carried no sword at his side, only a single staff, taller than most men, carved with spiraling symbols that pulsed faintly in the sun. It thudded softly against the cracked earth as he walked, each step deliberate and echoing in the silence he brought with him. The air grew thick, as though even the wind dared not speak in his presence. The warriors of Okamba stood aside without a word, watching the figure that the elders had traded a daughter for, unsure whether they were welcoming a savior or inviting doom. Some whispered his name like a curse. Bika meaning he who sees. Others called him Isathunzi Esabamvu, the Red Shadow. They said he had once slain 100 men in one night. That he drank only rainwater and spoke to no living man, only the dead. It was said that the ancestors walked with him, not in dreams like they did for the seers, but in the waking world, guiding his hand in war and whispering into his ear when others slept. A warrior? Yes, but a cursed one too. Aanda watched from behind a woven reed curtain, clutching the necklace her late grandmother had once worn, a pendant shaped like an open mouth, symbol of the griots. She watched Bika approach the center of the village, stopping before the sacred baobab of ancients, the oldest tree in all of Mbali, its roots rumored to touch the bones of the first people. His head lifted slightly, and for a moment she thought he looked directly at her. She stepped back instinctively, her heart slamming against her ribs. The marriage was set to take place under that ancient tree as was tradition. But the ceremony that followed was unlike any wedding Aanda had ever seen in her village. There were no drums. The talking drums, usually the heart of every celebration, were silent as stones. The women did not sing. No ululation of joy filled the air. There was no laughter, no dancing, no procession of gifts and colors, only low murmurs and bowed heads. The elders formed a half-circle around the couple, their faces unreadable. The clan's Isangoma, the spirit woman, wore her bones and beads but spoke no incantations. Even she looked uneasy. Aanda stood beside Bika in a simple white cloth, her hair freshly oiled and braided, her wrists adorned with copper rings passed down through generations of women. Her jaw was clenched. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, far beyond the crowd, far beyond this moment. Her voice remained locked in her throat. Bika said nothing. When the elder placed the symbolic cowrie shell necklace around both their necks, binding them in spirit and name, Aanda felt the weight not just of the shell, but of the silence that surrounded it. Her own people would not meet her gaze. It was as though she had already died, as though she was being handed to something beyond the human. Bika turned his face slightly in her direction when the ritual was complete, his expression unreadable behind the lines of ochre and carved wood. He nodded once, slowly, almost respectfully, but did not speak. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the presence of someone who had known too much death. A goat was slaughtered to seal the union, its blood poured into the earth at the base of the baobab. The spirits had been offered their due. The bride had been given. The blade had been received. As they walked away from the ceremony, villagers parted to let them pass, creating a corridor of unease. No one reached out to touch Aanda in blessing. No children threw petals. A few women held each other and turned their backs, while others watched in somber silence. Aanda kept her steps steady, refusing to let her fear show. She walked beside her new husband, who never once reached for her hand or acknowledged the stares. Her father did not even approach her to say goodbye. It was done. She was no longer his daughter. She was now the wife of the Red Warrior. They arrived at the hut prepared for them on the edge of the village, close to the trees where the wind sang strange songs at night. Aanda paused outside the doorway, her heart hammering. She did not know what waited for her inside. She had heard what some warriors did to their brides on the first night, especially the ones taken in payment. She had steeled herself for pain, humiliation, control. Bika stepped inside first, leaving the flap open behind him. After a moment's hesitation, she followed, her fingers tightening around her necklace. Inside, the hut was dimly lit with a single clay lamp casting shadows across the walls. Mats of woven reeds were laid out neatly, and a pot of steaming porridge sat on the small fire, untouched. Bika stood in the center of the room, back turned to her, his staff propped beside the door. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and removed his mask, laying it carefully on a small carved altar. Aanda took a tentative step forward, but he did not turn to her. Instead, he walked to the far corner of the room, picked up a rolled mat and placed it on the ground. Then, with a motion so gentle it startled her, he gestured to the larger sleeping mat near the center and sat on his own. Still silent. Still unreadable. Aanda remained standing for a long while, unsure of what she had just witnessed. She was married to a man who had never spoken to her, never touched her, and now, on the night expected to seal their bond, he had simply chosen the floor. Whatever this was, it was not what she had been prepared for. And in the confusion of that silence, her fear twisted into something else entirely. Curiosity. The sky was still smeared with the last light of dusk when Aanda was summoned. 2 elder women came for her, speaking little, their eyes downcast, their hands gentle but unrelenting as they led her across the quiet village. A child cried somewhere in the distance, but otherwise all was still. Even the dogs had fallen silent, as if they too were waiting to see what would unfold. Aanda walked barefoot, her anklets jingling softly with each step. She felt exposed, though she was wrapped modestly in the ceremonial cloth of a new bride. Her heart thudded like a war drum in her chest, her palms slick with sweat. Each step closer to the warrior's tent felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself wanted to hold her back. She had been told stories, some whispered, some shouted, about warriors and their first nights. That sometimes the taking was quick, brutal, and done only to mark a man's power over a woman. She had seen girls return from such nights with blank eyes and stiff spines. Now it was her turn. Her mind raced with worst-case visions, her stomach tight with fear, but her chin stayed high. If pain was to come, she would face it without giving him the pleasure of seeing her tremble. The tent stood apart from the rest, just beyond the outer ring of huts, beneath a cluster of trees that swayed gently in the night wind. Small woven charms of bone and feather hung from the branches, turning slowly. A soft glow from within flickered like firelight, casting long shadows through the fabric walls. The elder women left her there, neither blessing nor comforting her. Aanda stood alone, staring at the entrance. She inhaled once, steadying herself, then pushed the flap aside. Inside, the tent was warm with the scent of wood smoke and roasted food. A small fire burned in a central pit, flames dancing lazily, crackling softly. There were no weapons, no signs of violence. Only order, every mat rolled neatly, every pot lidded, a carved bowl of water sitting beside the entrance. And there he was, Bika the warrior, sitting cross-legged by the fire, mask removed, his face painted with faint red ochre lines that shimmered in the firelight. She froze in the doorway. He looked up at her, not with hunger or entitlement but with something else. Something unreadable. "You are hungry," he said. His voice was low and rich, like distant thunder. Aanda hesitated. She wasn't sure if it was a command or an invitation. He gestured to the woven mat beside him. "Sit. Eat." Still on edge, she stepped closer and lowered herself slowly to the mat, her spine straight, every sense on high alert. He handed her a split piece of roasted yam, still steaming, and poured a small calabash of palm wine, the scent sweet and earthy. She took them, hands trembling only slightly, and watched him through narrowed eyes as she took her first bite. He did not eat immediately. He watched the fire instead, silent for a long time as though the flames were telling him something. Finally he spoke again. "I came not to take but to give." Aanda stared at him. "What do you mean?" He did not look at her, but the side of his mouth tilted, almost like a smile. "You were sold," he said plainly. "But I did not come to collect." Her eyes widened slightly. "Then why are you here?" Bika's gaze finally met hers. In the flickering light, she could see the intensity behind them, not cruel, not soft, but deep, like a well with no bottom. "I have carried death on my back since I was a boy. I have slept in the jaws of lions and walked through the valley of drought. I have killed for coin, for vengeance, for nothing at all. But I was not born to destroy. I came to put something right." Aanda felt a strange chill despite the fire's warmth. "And what does that have to do with me?" Bika leaned back slightly, his face calm. "You are the seed. The kind that breaks the stone to grow." Aanda did not understand. She wanted to demand answers, to ask what kind of game he was playing, but her words caught in her throat. He wasn't behaving like a man claiming his bride. There was no hunger in his eyes, no possession in his touch. Only stillness. Like a mountain. She finished the yam slowly, unsure of what was happening, unsure of who he really was. When the fire began to die down, Bika stood, picked up a rolled mat, and walked past her toward the door. She turned to watch him, expecting him to simply step outside for fresh air. But he knelt just beyond the flap, unrolled the mat beneath the open sky, and laid down. "You're not sleeping here?" she asked, frowning. He looked up at the stars. "I sleep with the sky. I hear the ancestors better out here." She stared at the tense fabric walls for a long time after that. The silence felt different now, less like danger and more like a puzzle. Her thoughts tumbled over themselves. If he didn't want her, what did he want? What did it mean to come for a bride and choose the floor? She lay down, but sleep did not come. Outside, she could hear the fire snapping, and beyond that, the faint rustle of leaves and the whisper of insects. She could sense Bika's presence just beyond the tent wall, not threatening but heavy, like the weight of a story that hadn't been told yet. And when she looked up at the ceiling of the tent, the shadows danced like fireflies. Aanda didn't sleep. Not because she feared him anymore. But because something inside her had begun to stir. Not love, not yet. But curiosity. And with it, the first flicker of power. The days that followed did not unfold as Aanda, or anyone in the village, had expected. No storm arrived in the shape of Bika. No cries emerged from their tent in the night. Instead there was silence. Not the heavy, brooding silence of menace, but the kind that made things grow. Like the hush that comes before the first rains, when the soil holds its breath. Each morning Bika rose with the sun, sometimes before it. He would fold his mat, gather his staff, and disappear without a word. For the first few days, Aanda watched him from behind the curtain, expecting to see him vanish into the trees, returning only when the sky turned orange with dusk. But by the third morning she followed. What she saw surprised her. Bika knelt beside a group of village boys near the old cattle pen, mending a broken fence with patient hands. One of the children, barely old enough to hold a tool, kept dropping his end of the wooden plank. Bika didn't scold him. Instead, he shifted the weight, guiding the boy's hand until it held firm. No shouting. No showing off. Just presence. Later that day she saw him again, this time at the western edge of the village, clearing dry brush with the older men, his staff resting against a stump nearby. Sweat rolled down his back, but he worked without complaint, shoulder to shoulder with those who had once feared him. The villagers, hesitant at first, began to greet him in murmurs. A few even offered him water. In the evenings he brought cassava cuttings and young banana shoots, planting them in cleared spaces near the children's compound. Aanda saw him scoop the earth with his hands like someone returning home. She had never seen a warrior plant anything. Yet here he was, coaxing life from dead soil. She stopped watching from afar. On the fifth night, when she brought him roasted maize from the communal fire, he surprised her again. "You know maps?" he asked, gesturing to a flat slab of bark he had carved with lines. She shook her head, and he motioned for her to sit. That night, beneath the soft hum of crickets, he taught her the markings of trails, rivers, old trade paths that once connected the southern clans. He showed her how stars guided warriors, and how the wind could speak of ambushes long before they arrived. He spoke in low tones, his words deliberate, never hurried. She listened, absorbing every detail like a dry sponge drinks the rain. Each night after that, their lessons continued. First maps, then war formations drawn in ash, then the coded gestures of battlefield spirit language, symbols whispered into the dust that only the trained could see. Yet he never glorified war. He spoke of it with a kind of solemn reverence, as one might speak of a necessary fire that clears rot, not a celebration of flame. Still he never touched her. Aanda began to question the stories. This was the man who had supposedly bathed in blood, who wore the skins of his enemies and spoke only to the dead. But she had seen his hands hold children's shoulders without trembling. She had seen his quiet patience when coaxing cassava into hard soil. She had heard him laugh, softly, barely more than a breath, when a lizard startled her one night and she jumped back with a yelp. That laugh lingered in her chest longer than she expected. Their nightly talk stretched further. One night, when sleep would not come, she stepped outside their tent and found him watching the stars as he always did. She sat beside him without a word. He pointed out constellations, some she knew, others strange and beautiful, and told her their names in an old tongue. His voice carried stories not found in her clan's songs. Of sandwalkers, of firebirds, of lovers cursed to meet only during eclipses. She found herself laughing more. Not just polite smiles but real laughter, soft, sudden bursts that caught her off guard. It didn't feel like betrayal anymore. It felt like freedom. And when he laughed too, short, rough, like a man and used to the sound, it felt like they were cracking open the silence together. They began to walk the riverbanks at night, past the fields where the cassava now took root. The river shimmered with moonlight, fireflies blinking lazily above the reeds. Sometimes they walked in silence. Other times she asked questions. About where he'd come from. About why he didn't sleep inside the tent. About the blade, Tunzi. "The blade was never mine," he said one night. "It belonged to a king I once failed." Aanda tilted her head. "You failed?" Bika nodded. "I was young. Proud. I let vengeance cloud the mission. I brought the blade back, but not the king's son." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Blood has a memory. This blade remembers mine." That night, when they returned to the tent, Aanda didn't lie on her mat immediately. She sat by the fire long after he had stepped outside, tracing the edge of her palm with her thumb, the quiet pulsing in her ears like a distant drumbeat. Something was shifting between them. She could feel it. A seed was growing in the space between their words, in the way he handed her the carved maps now without explanation, trusting she'd know how to read them. In the way he waited for her outside the tent without calling her name. This was not the story she had been given. And each day, with every laugh, every quiet lesson, every walk along the river, Aanda felt herself stepping farther from the girl who had once wept at the idea of being sold like cattle. She still did not know what Bika wanted. But she was beginning to understand what she wanted. And that was more dangerous than any blade. It began with whispers at the edge of the market square, old men muttering behind their hands, women pausing mid-weave to share furtive glances. By the time the sun touched the shoulders of the western hills, the whispers had thickened into something louder, heavier, shaped like judgment. Aanda sensed the shift before she heard the words. She felt it in the way hands no longer lingered in greeting, in the narrowed eyes of aunties who once helped tie her headscarf, in the sudden silences that followed when she entered a space. And then the summons came. It was the eldest of the Okamba Council, gray-bearded Mabutho, who called the gathering beneath the baobab of ancients, the same place where she had been traded for a blade. The village gathered slowly, faces pinched with curiosity, some with disapproval, some with hunger for drama. Drums stayed silent. Even the children, usually a tide of noise, sat quiet and wide-eyed. Bika stood to one side, wrapped in his ochre robe, face calm as unreadable as ever. Aanda stood near him, her chin high, hands at her sides. The sun bore down on them both, but she did not flinch. Mabutho's voice carried, brittle but firm. You were given to our clan to bind a sacred pact. You were to be wed in blood and body as is our custom. Yet this warrior, he spat the word, lies beside the river like a spirit and treats his bride like a sister. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few men nodded in agreement. One of the younger warriors, Duma, stepped forward. This is not a marriage. This is shame in cloth. We gave you our daughter and you give us no heir, no honor. What kind of warrior plants cassava and refuses his woman? Bika said nothing. His silence, once awe-inspiring, now festered in their eyes like cowardice. Mabutho turned to Aanda. Speak, girl. Is this man fulfilling his duty? Aanda felt her heart pound, but her voice did not waver. He honors me more than my own blood did. The words fell like stones. The murmurs ceased. Even the wind paused. He honors me, she repeated, louder this time, her voice rising like a tide. When you sold me, none of you asked what I wanted. None of you wept. None of you questioned trading a daughter for a weapon. But he did not touch me until I spoke. He did not take until I gave. He listens. He teaches. He plants. He heals. That is more than I have ever seen from the ones who call themselves men of this clan. A long silence. Then the griot, the village's keeper of stories and song, who had watched from beneath the shade of the baobab, stirred. Her name was Nono, old as roots, her back bent but her eyes sharp as a hawk's. She stepped forward slowly, tapping her carved staff on the earth. Say it again, she said, voice rasping like a dried drum skin. Aanda met her gaze and repeated, steady and clear. He honors me more than my own blood did. The griot closed her eyes and nodded once. Then she sang. It was not loud. Just a single line, a melody born of the moment. He who came with the blade but touched only the soil. She who was sold but rose like the sun. Gasps followed her voice. The villagers looked at one another, unsure whether to scorn or cheer. But it was too late. The words had been sung, and once sung they could not be unsung. Children repeated the line under their breath that evening, giggling. Young women whispered it to each other while drawing water. Even the old ones, those who had never questioned tradition, found themselves mouthing the tune as they chewed on kola nuts. Something had cracked. The clan tried to bury it at first. The elders met again behind closed doors, muttering about curses, about rebellious women, about the weakening of order. But the song moved faster than them. Like wildfire. Women began asking questions. Why must marriage begin with taking? Why must daughters be traded and not consulted? Why did power mean only force? Men grew uneasy. If this warrior, this Bika, could command respect without domination, then what did that say about them? If Aanda could speak in the square and not be silenced, who else might stand beside her? In their hut that night, Bika did not speak immediately. He stared at the fire as he often did, shadows dancing across his face. Finally he said, You have started something. Aanda looked at him. So did you. They sat in silence, not the fearful kind, but the rich, full silence that grows after truth has been spoken aloud. Outside the wind shifted. And the fireflies began to gather. The night it happened, the air felt different, dense, electric, as if the sky was holding its breath. Aanda lay restless beneath the woven thatch of their hut, eyes fixed on the flickering shadows cast by the dwindling fire outside. The world was quiet, unnaturally so. Even the insects had hushed their nocturnal songs. She slipped into sleep like a leaf sinking into still water. But this was no ordinary dream. She stood on a vast plain beneath a dark sky speckled with unfamiliar stars. The wind hummed a low, pulsing rhythm, and the grasses whispered her name in tones that echoed through her bones. Before her stood a great baobab, its trunk impossibly wide, its roots spreading like a web across the land. From its branches hung charms, bones, feathers, and coils of light that shimmered like fireflies caught in spider silk. A figure stepped from behind the tree. She was tall, robed in layers of cloth the color of ash and clay, her hair wrapped in coils of gold and copper. Her eyes shone with a light not of this world. Aanda somehow knew, deep in her marrow, this was no ordinary spirit. "You carry the mouth of Isavoma," the woman said. Her voice did not shake the air, it shook the world inside Aanda. "The mouth of divine speech," the spirit answered. "What you say will ripple through hearts, split lies from truth, shift rivers of thought. You are not just to witness change. You are to speak it into being." Aanda's mouth opened, but no words came. "You have already begun," the woman continued. "The song has been sung. The seed is awake. But now you must learn to wield your tongue like a spear, or it will wound without purpose." The matriarch reached out and touched Aanda's forehead. A warmth flooded through her like honey poured from the sun. Then the dream shattered. Aanda awoke with a gasp, heart hammering in her chest, skin damp with sweat. The hut was silent again, but she felt the dream still clinging to her, like a veil just lifted. She sat upright and whispered the first words that came to her. The fire outside flared. Not wildly. Not dangerously. But as if it had heard her and answered. She rose, stepped outside, and found Bika seated as he always was, under the open sky, eyes closed, breathing like a tree drinks rain. He opened his eyes the moment she approached. "You were called." She stared at him. "How do you know?" "I heard your voice in the wind," he said simply. And the fire answered. Aanda sat beside him, shivering though the night was warm. "She told me I carry Isavoma." Bika nodded, unsurprised. "It is rare. It runs not through blood but through purpose. It chooses those who stand where change must pass." "Why me?" "Because your silence would have been safe," he said, turning to face her. "And you chose to speak." She looked at her hands, flexed her fingers. "I feel it. But I don't know how to hold it." He reached beside him and picked up a hollow reed, carved with tiny spirals. "Then we begin again." And so he taught her. Not how to speak louder, but how to speak truer. He showed her the old songs of the griots, how each tone carried weight, how cadence could stir memory, how silence placed between words could be more powerful than shouts. He taught her how to read the breath of a crowd, how to recognize the moment when ears open and hearts unclench. "Do not speak to be heard," he told her one night as they sat by the riverbank. "Speak to be felt. Even by those who don't yet know they're listening." Aanda began practicing in the mornings, whispering to the plants as she watered them. When she did, the saplings seemed to stand straighter. Birds flew closer. Children quieted when she entered the square, leaning in as if expecting a tale. The power did not come as lightning. It came like tide, slow, sure, reshaping the shore without shouting. In the quiet of one evening, while tracing the path of stars with her finger, she asked him, "You were chosen too, weren't you?" He nodded. "As a boy. I saw the dead before I knew how to count. They taught me to listen more than speak. But I was young. I used the gift to command fear, not understanding. It nearly destroyed me. Is that why you never raised your voice even when they insulted you?" He smiled faintly. "I once believed power was a blade. Now I know, it's a voice that shapes what the blade cannot." Aanda reached for his hand. He let her. Their fingers locked, not as conqueror and bride, but as equals sharing a secret the world had forgotten. Above them, the moon rose full, and the reeds along the river began to sway in rhythm, as if humming a song only they could hear. Aanda closed her eyes. And the wind whispered back. The dry wind that rolled across the Mbali plains one morning carried with it more than dust. It brought warning. A scout returned, breathless, torn sandals hanging by threads, eyes wide with the terror he had just outrun. "The Nyami are coming." The village fell silent. The Nyami clan, Okamba's bitter rivals from across the river Kazi, had long been kept at bay, more by distance and superstition than strength. But word had spread beyond the hills. The Okamba had traded for Umtunzi, the ancestral blade of kings. Now the Nyami, hungry for power and eager to restore their fading prestige, were coming to claim it. By dusk, the council of elders was in disarray. Fear crackled in their voices like dry branches in fire. Some argued for immediate surrender, others for evacuation. The warriors, few in number and poorly armed, looked to the ground, shame and dread thick in their eyes. That night, while the elders bickered beneath the baobab of ancients, Aanda stood alone near the great fire, the stars glittering above like 1,000 distant spirits watching. She felt the pull in her chest, the weight of choice. The gift of Isavoma pulsed like a heartbeat behind her ribs. She stepped forward into the circle of firelight, her voice cutting through the arguing like a blade through grass. "If we give them the blade," she said, "we give them our soul. They will not stop at Umtunzi. They will take the fields. They will take the children. They will take us. Mabutho scoffed. And what would you do, daughter of disgrace? Fight them with words. Yes, she said, her voice rising like the wind. With words. With earth. With fire. With spirit. And with blade if I must. She turned to the warriors, then to the women, to the farmers, to the children gathered at the edges. We will not be remembered as the clan who bowed. We will be remembered as the people who stood, even if we fall. A hush followed. Then a murmur. Then a cry, she speaks the truth. And then another, we follow Aanda. Bika watched from the edge of the firelight. When the flames had settled and the people dispersed to make ready, he approached her silently. You lead them now, he said. Aanda looked at him, both fear and fire in her eyes. But I have never held a blade. He unwrapped the cloth he always carried over his back and drew it out. Umtunzi. The ancestral blade gleamed with a dull light, as though it remembered blood, remembered battles, remembered names long lost to sand. He held it out to her. This was never meant for war, Bika said, but for awakening. Aanda took the sword, its weight both terrifying and strangely familiar in her hands. We will not win by strength, she said. No, he agreed. But you know their weakness. She nodded. Pride. And blindness. The next 3 days moved like storms and fast forward. Aanda called a war council, not of elders but of every mind willing to listen. Farmers offered knowledge of the terrain, paths only goats used, gullies that swallowed sound, termite mounds hollow enough to hide scouts. Bika shared ancient battle formations used by spirit-touched warriors of old, ways to shift the enemy's focus, to make their numbers feel smaller. He showed them how to send messages through drums, using rhythms disguised as harvest songs. The children painted messages of warning on leaves and let the wind scatter them near the river. Old women prepared powders of ground kola and ash that could be thrown into the eyes of charging men. Hunters laid traps with snares made of sinew and bone, buried beneath deceptive grass. And every night, Aanda stood in the center of the square, speaking. She told stories of the ancestors who had stood against monsters. Of the matriarch who once held off bandits with nothing but a cooking stick. Of the spirit lion that protected those who dared to dream of a new world. Her voice carried through the village like a drumbeat. Even the most timid men stood taller. The women sharpened machetes and prepared bundles of thorns. The children practiced throwing stones at mangoes suspended from trees. On the morning of the 5th day, the Nyami appeared on the ridge, painted in ochre and bone, their war cries echoing through the ravine like the screeches of carrion birds. But when they descended the path toward the Okamba, they found nothing waiting. No warriors. No lines of defense. Only a single figure standing in the field of cassava. Aanda. She wore a cloak of reed-woven cloth, the wind tossing it like wings. Umtunzi rested at her side, not raised. Her eyes met the enemy's chief, the towering, scar-slashed Umfazi of the Nyami, and she smiled. The Nyami paused, confused. Then the earth moved. Hidden trenches collapsed beneath their feet. Dust exploded into their faces, laced with blinding ash. From behind termite hills, slings and spears flew. Warriors appeared like ghosts from the river mist, striking then vanishing. And above it all, Aanda's voice rang out, chanting not in fear but in rhythm, a battle song half prayer, half command. Bika moved like a shadow, protecting her flank, never taking a kill he did not need. He guarded her, not because she was weak but because she was the flame that lit the storm. The battle did not last long. The Nyami, disoriented, outmaneuvered, and struck by the force of spirit and strategy, began to retreat. Their leader fell, wounded not by blade, but by the shame of defeat in a war led by a woman, and a clan they had once called broken. As the dust settled, Aanda stood in the silence, Umtunzi still untouched by blood. The people gathered slowly, limping, laughing, crying. We did not win, Aanda said to them. We remembered who we were. And under the eyes of sky and spirit, a new story took root in Bali, one not written by blades alone, but by the voice of a girl once traded like cattle, now echoed in every beating heart that dared to stand beside her. The dawn rose blood-red over Mbali, painting the horizon in strokes of copper and fire. The wind carried the heavy scent of rain not yet fallen, a hush blanketing the land as if nature itself braced for what was to come. In the heart of the sacred grove, where the towering Imuthi tree reached toward the heavens like the fingers of the ancestors themselves, Aanda stood cloaked in white and ash, her body painted in the ancient patterns of the matriarchs. Her eyes shimmered with the light of spirit fire, her lips murmuring the old chants that Bika had taught her, the language not of the living but of the dead who still watched. All around her, the warriors of Okamba gathered, not in rows of discipline but in ripples of resolve. Women bore short blades wrapped in dyed cloth. Men held staffs carved with symbols of their lineage. Children, too young to fight, carried gourd drums and whispered protective songs into the wind. Across the clearing beneath the twisted limbs of the Umuthi, the Nyami clan emerged like a storm tide, rank upon rank of ochre-painted bodies, adorned in bone and brass. At their head strode Chief Mvulaine, the war chief of the Nyami, known as the Elephant of the South. His chest gleamed with scars, his hair wound in tight coils of copper. In his hands, he bore the twin axes of his ancestors, and his eyes burned with fury. The air grew thick. The sky darkened, the clouds swirling above like coiled snakes. Then came the drumbeat, low, slow, pulsing like the heart of the world. Aanda stepped forward, not walking but riding the wind. She was atop a zebra, its mane braided with cowrie shells, its flanks streaked with white chalk. The beast moved without fear as if it too had been called by the spirits. Her cloak billowed behind her like wings. In her hand Umtunzi gleamed, not silver but a deep, muted gold as though it had awakened from long sleep. The Nyami paused. For a breath. For a heartbeat. They had expected a skirmish. They had not expected her. She raised her blade but not as a threat. It caught the morning light and reflected it like a beacon. I am Aanda, daughter of Okamba, she called, her voice rising above the wind, above the drums, above the doubt. I was given in trade like a goat and returned as a storm. Today we fight not for revenge. We fight so that no daughter, no son, will ever be sold for peace again. The Nyami jeered but not all. Some faltered. Some looked to their leader with questions in their eyes. Mvulaine roared and charged, slicing the air with his twin axes. Aanda dismounted, passing the zebra to a child who stood barefoot in the grass. She stepped into the circle beneath the Umuthi tree, where the spirits were thickest, where ancestors gathered in whispers. She met Mvulaine's charge not with brute strength but with grace. Bika's training and the ancestors' presence guided her steps. Umtunzi danced in her hand, not slashing but redirecting, deflecting, shaping. Steel clashed. Earth shook. Wind howled. They moved like storm and fire, he a fury of brute force, she a rhythm of purpose. Twice he struck and twice she fell to her knees, only to rise again, chants on her tongue and fire in her eyes. She circled him, found the rhythm of his anger, the gap between his breath and his strike. And when he lifted both axes to bring them down in one final, crushing blow, she stepped inside the arc and struck. Not to kill, but to disarm. Umtunzi slid along his shoulder, severing the leather cords that held his weapons. His axes fell to the earth with a muffled thud. He stood blinking, chest heaving, vulnerable for the first time in decades. Aanda placed Umtunzi at his throat. Silence swallowed the grove. Then she dropped the blade. I could kill you, she said. But the world does not need another dead chief. It needs a living bridge. She turned slowly, arms wide, addressing both clans. We were never meant to be enemies. The same blood runs beneath our skins. The same drums echo in our bones. Let this war end not in death, but in bond. In unity. In sacred joining. Mvulaine stared at her, stunned. The mighty chief, the Elephant of the South, dropped to his knees, not in defeat but in awe. You carry the mouth of the dead, he whispered. I carry the voice of the living, she answered. At that moment the sky split open. Lightning cracked above the Umuthi tree, forking into the branches like veins of light. Thunder rolled across the plain, shaking both Nyami and Okamba alike. The leaves above them turned silver, shimmering with spirit breath. A great wind rose, gentle, cool and clean. The elders fell to their knees. The warriors bowed their heads. The children laughed as if the world had been reborn. From the canopy, a single feather drifted down, pure white, untarnished. It landed at Aanda's feet. The griots would say later that it was the approval of the ancestors. That the spirits themselves had crowned her a peacemaker, a queen forged not in fire but in word. That night, beneath the same tree where war nearly erupted, both clans shared food, song and drink. The zebra was returned to the wild. The axes of Mvulaine were buried at the tree's base as a symbol of surrender. And Umtunzi? Aanda returned it to its wrappings, placed it at the foot of the baobab of ancients and declared, this blade is no longer a prize. It is a reminder that true strength lies not in steel, but in truth spoken boldly. The wind carried her words far beyond Mbali. And the story of the girl sold for a sword who turned war into peace became legend across the lands. The days that followed the battle beneath the Umuthi tree were unlike anything the Mbali lands had known before. No smoke curled from burning huts. No wails of mourning echoed in the fields. Instead, laughter returned to the air, soft at first as if people didn't quite trust it, but growing day by day, like a song rediscovered. Under the great baobab, where once desperate trades were made and old men clung to broken wisdom, the people gathered, Okamba and Nyami alike. No walls separated them. No weapons hung at their sides. Just skin, laughter, and hope. The griots, dressed in robes the color of ripe tamarind, stood before the people, flanked by the elders of both clans. Their drums did not call for war this time but for rebirth. Aanda stood at the center, the morning sun casting a golden crown upon her hair, unadorned by jewels or beads. Her eyes bore the weight of battles won and choices made. Beside her, Bika stood like a shadow and a flame, silent, strong, his ochre robes rustling in the breeze. An elder stepped forward, an old woman from the Nyami clan with a voice like the riverbed during drought. From blood, she said, sprouted a seed. The griots repeated, from blood, a seed. From trade came truth. From trade, truth. From a girl came a new dawn. And so they named her Nkosi Yamoya, Queen of Spirit. Not queen of land nor queen of clan but of the breath between people. The voice that bonds. The force that does not rule but calls all things into harmony. There was no throne, only the open earth. No crown, only the wind combing through her hair. No scepter, only the memory of Umtunzi, now resting in peace beneath the baobab's roots. When the voices rose in song she did not weep. She smiled, and her smile carried the strength of mountains that had endured storms. She turned to Bika as the people chanted her name. And what title will you take, warrior of the red sands? Asked one of the Nyami elders. Bika looked not at the people but at Aanda. None, he said. Titles weigh heavier than truth. I ask only to walk beside her. Aanda reached for his hand. And that, she said, is the strongest place to stand. So they stood, side by side, not as ruler and consort, not as savior and warrior, but as two souls bound by purpose. And from that union of spirit and will, a new dream was born. In the seasons that followed they began to build, not castles, not shrines but a school. Not of rote words or memorized chants but of power, the kind that lives in truth, in balance, in the voice. Children came from both clans and from distant ones who had heard whispers of the girl who spoke with the ancestors and the man who had laid his blade down. Boys and girls trained side by side. They learned the dance of battle, yes, but also the wisdom of plants, the language of the wind, the way to listen with the chest, not just the ears. They read maps and studied spirit codes. They debated law and sang songs of those who came before. It was said no student graduated without first failing, and learning from that fall. For Aanda taught that strength was not in standing tall, but in knowing how to rise again. They named it Inluya Kinesika, the House of Becoming. The warriors it produced carried no fixed uniforms. Some wore feathers, others beads, some nothing at all but paint and purpose. But wherever they walked, peace often followed. Not because they carried blades but because they carried stories, and the power to share them. The Okamba and Nyami no longer spoke of being two peoples. They became one, with the river that once divided them now called Emazweni, the river of words. Children played in it and elders sat beside it, telling stories to whoever would listen. And when visitors came, envoys from distant valleys or curious nomads from the desert trails, they would ask, who rules here? And the people would smile and say, no one rules. But Aanda walks among us. In time her name drifted into legend as all great names do. But unlike most legends hers did not fade into myth. It lived on in voices, spoken by students of the warrior school, by mothers telling bedtime tales, by griots singing under moonlight. And in every child who dared to ask, why not? And every adult brave enough to answer, let's find out, her spirit thrived. Bika, ever silent beside her, was known not by name but by deed. He became the keeper of quiet strength, the one who reminded people that peace too must be trained for, daily, fiercely, faithfully. And so, under sun and spirit, in lands once cracked by drought and war, Aanda and Bika shaped not just a new clan but a new way. Not with the sword, but with the soul. In the waning golden light of a savanna dusk, a solitary drum pulsed against the hush of a listening world. Beneath the ancient baobab, the same tree beneath which a girl once stood trembling and brave, a griot sat cross-legged, wrapped in dyed indigo cloth, the edges worn from a lifetime of travels and tales. His fingers tapped rhythm into the earth, while children gathered at his feet, eyes wide, hearts open. The elders sat nearby on carved stools, and mothers leaned forward with infants bound to their backs, while young warriors in training stood with staffs in hand, feet rooted but souls in motion. And when the drumbeat stilled, the griot lifted his head, his voice soft but soaked in memory. "Have I told you the song of Aanda the flame?" he asked. "Yes," the children chimed, giggling. "Tell it again." The griot smiled, eyes wrinkling like old parchment. "Then listen not with your ears alone but with your spirit. For this is not just a tale, it is the truth dressed in music." He drew his breath deep, let it linger, and then began. "She was born in the time of dying crops," he said, "when the rain forgot our names and the vultures remembered us too well. Aanda's village, Okamba, was wilting under sun and struggle. Her father, once a proud elder, saw ruin at the edge of every horizon. When the fields gave dust instead of grain, when the warriors returned fewer than they had left, he made a choice rooted not in cruelty but desperation. A bride for a blade. His daughter, bright-eyed, sharp-tongued, who dreamed of rivers and thunder, was traded to a stranger for Umtunzi, the ancestral sword whispered to bring victory. But it was not victory they received, the griot said, his voice dropping to a hush. It was revelation. Bika, the man from the red sands, came not with violence but with silence. He did not take. He did not demand. On their wedding night, he offered her roasted yam and palm wine, and chose the stars over her skin. The village whispered. The elders growled. But something new began to breathe. Aanda had been sold like cattle, but Bika treated her like a queen the world had yet to see. In the hush of days that followed, she watched him, tending children, planting cassava, sketching war maps in the dirt beside her. He taught her not only how to fight but how to see, how to hear the hum beneath the world. Love grew not in fire but in ember. Steady. Earnest. When the elders demanded blood and consummation, Bika stood firm. Aanda too found her voice, and for the first time, it rang in the square, not as a daughter but as a storm. She honored herself, the griot sang, and in doing so taught us all what honor means. Then came the spirit dream. A matriarch from the realm beyond shadows visited her and named her chosen. Aanda awoke with the gift of Isavuma, divine speech, the language of influence, the tongue of griots and ghosts. From that day her words no longer landed like leaves, they struck like lightning. When the rival Nyami came, drawn by hunger and greed for the Umtunzi blade, Aanda led the war council. She bore no rank. She had no title. But when she spoke, the cowardly stood tall, and the doubtful found direction. And Bika, the warrior of legends, placed the sacred blade in her hands and said, "This was never meant for war but for awakening." And awaken she did. They fought beneath the spirit tree, the Umuthi whose roots touched bone and whose branches kissed the sky. Aanda, glowing with ancestral fire, faced Mvulane the elephant. She bested him, not with wrath but with wisdom. She spared him not because she lacked power but because she understood it. And as thunder cracked and the spirits roared, Aanda called for unity. Not conquest. Not obedience. But bond. The griot paused and looked to the children, who by now were silent, reverent. "You see," he said, "Aanda was never meant to be bought. She was meant to be born. Not from a womb but from witness. From the fire she walked through and the wind she spoke to. The clans, once enemies, now danced together. Aanda was crowned Nkosi Yamoya, Queen of Spirit. She ruled no land, commanded no army, but wherever she walked, walls crumbled and bridges rose." And Bika? He asked for nothing but her side. From their bond came Indluya Kinesika, the house of becoming. A place where boys and girls trained not only in blade and body but in being. They learned that to be strong was to be true. That to fight was not just to strike but to stand, for others, for justice, for story. Years passed. Aanda aged like the earth, still fierce, still kind. Bika remained her shadow, her moonlight. And when the time came for them to pass into the world beyond breath, they did so without fear. But their legacy. "Oh," the griot said, his voice rising, "their legacy burned brighter than any pyre." He lifted his drum and struck a steady rhythm. Aanda the flame, the children sang, their voices lifting into the night. Aanda the flame, who walked with thunder. Aanda the flame, who spoke with spirits. Aanda the flame, who chose love and was never owned. They sang of the bride who was sold, but never broken. Who met a warrior not with fear, but with fire. Who turned swords into stories, and enemies into kin. The griot leaned forward, voice a whisper again. So remember, children of Mbali. Power is not in the blade. It is in the telling. It is in the choice to love when hate is easier. To speak when silence is safer. To listen when the ancestors call. The sun had long set now, the stars blinking awake. A little girl, no older than Aanda was when she was traded, raised her hand. Is it all true? The griot touched her cheek. As true as the wind that carries your name when you shout it across the river. And is the blade still buried beneath the baobab? He smiled. Go see for yourself. But you may not find it. For some say once peace was made, it turned to ash and scattered on the breeze. Why? Because the sword had done its work. And now, the words must do the rest. He tapped his drum once more. And the song continued. The flames that once danced behind Aanda's eyes now flicker in countless others. Her story, though rooted in a single girl, became a river that split into many, flowing into hearts, homes and histories across Mbali and beyond. She was once a name whispered in pity. Then a name roared in battle. Now her name lives in breath, in every child who chooses truth over fear, in every girl who dares to dream past the fences of tradition, and in every boy taught that strength lives not only in fists but in listening. It is said the wind in Bali changed after Aanda. It began to carry more than dust and heat, it carried voices. Girls began to speak more loudly. Boys began to listen more closely. And elders, once trapped in the prisons of old thinking, began to wonder, what else can we change? The Okamba and Nyami no longer warred over land or legend. They met by the river Emazweni not with spears but with songs. Disputes were settled with counsel, not conquest. Warriors still trained, but so did healers, farmers and poets. No one path was greater than another because the path of spirit, Aanda's path, ran through them all. Her decision to spare Mvulane the elephant, once seen as weakness, became a cornerstone of the new law. Mercy is power restrained by wisdom. That lesson alone saved countless lives in the years that followed. What she and Bika built, Inluya Kinisika, the house of becoming, grew beyond a school. It became a movement. Tribes sent their young there not just to train but to transform. And when those students returned to their homelands, they brought with them not domination but depth. They brought questions, ideas, stories, and those stories did more than entertain. They healed. One of the most powerful traditions to arise from their legacy was called Yulunjiso, the speaking circle. Every full moon, villages across Mbali sat in circles, young and old, and spoke truth. Children shared dreams. Elders shared regrets. No titles mattered. Only voice. Only spirit. And through this, the griots became more vital than ever before. They were not just entertainers, they were keepers. Memory walkers. Flame carriers. The griot who sang Aanda's story beneath the baobab passed it to his apprentice, who passed it again and again, until it became not a tale from the past, but a living echo in the present. Because the heart of the story was never the blade. It was the choice. Aanda was given to a man for a sword. But she chose to rise. She chose not to hate. She chose to speak when silence would have been safer. She chose to lead not with violence but with vision. And Bika, that strange red-robed warrior, he chose to walk beside her, not ahead of her. In a world that expected him to dominate, he chose devotion. He listened. He taught. And he stepped back so her light could blaze. They redefined power, not as something taken but something shared. In the end, it wasn't Mtunzi, the ancestral blade, that saved the clans. It was the stories carried in spirit and song. It was the voices that refused to be silenced. The love that was chosen, not forced. The unity born from humility, not conquest. That is why Aanda was called the flame. Because flames do not ask permission to rise. They transform everything they touch. Even now, generations later, her presence lingers. Not in tombs or monuments, but in the eyes of girls who refuse to be traded. In the minds of boys who choose kindness over cruelty. In the drumbeat before a story. In the silence after one ends. Sometimes, late at night, beneath the rustle of spirit trees, the wind hums a name. Aanda. And if you listen closely, not just with your ears, but with your soul, you will hear the truth she left us all. We are not what they make of us. We are what we choose to become. And that, more than any sword, is the sharpest power of all.